A mysterious drifter arrives at the ranch and captures a cowboy's heart. Cowboy Love Secrets, a slow burn romance story. The first thing Eli Calloway noticed was the stranger's hands. They were folded across his chest like a man who had learned, somewhere along the road, that the only safe place to keep your hands was close to yourself. One palm rested over the other, fingers loose, knuckles lightly dusted with old scars that caught the pale morning light filtering through the barn slats. Eli stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds before he said a single word, 3 seconds of absolute stillness while the world outside carried on without him, while the roosters crowed and the horses shifted in their stalls and the Texas dawn turned the sky the color of a peach somebody had left on a windowsill too long. 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, something happened to Eli Calloway that he would spend the next 4 months trying to name. "Hey," he finally said, his voice coming out lower than he intended, rougher, like it had scraped something loose on its way out. "Hey, you, wake up." The stranger opened his eyes. They were a particular shade of brown that Eli had never quite seen on a person before, the kind of warm, deep amber that you find at the bottom of a glass jar of honey when the light hits it sideways. They were alert immediately, which surprised Eli. Most people, when startled awake in a strange place, went through a whole performance of confusion and disorientation. But this man just looked at Eli with those honey-dark eyes, calm and direct, like he had already figured out exactly where he was and what kind of situation he was in, and had simply been waiting for Eli to catch up. "Morning," the stranger said. His voice was low and unhurried. Smooth the way river stones are smooth, like it had been worn that way by a long time of moving through the world. "You're in my barn," Eli said. "I know." The stranger sat up slowly, stretching his arms above his head with the easy, unself-conscious grace of someone who slept rough often enough that waking up in a stranger's barn had stopped feeling like something that required an apology. He was tall, even folded into that sitting position. Dark hair a little long, curling at the nape of his neck. A jaw that looked like it had been defined by too many nights sleeping on hard ground and too few nights sleeping anywhere soft. He had the lean, worked kind of build that came not from a gym but from actual labor, from actually carrying things, lifting things, from the kind of physical life that left its marks. "I came in around 2 in the morning. Your front gate was open. I knocked on the house, nobody answered." "I sleep heavy," Eli said, which was true, which was something he hated about himself, especially now that he was the only one left to run the ranch. "I figured." The stranger didn't say it meanly. He reached beside him and picked up a worn canvas duffel bag, slinging it over one shoulder in a single practiced motion. "I'll get out of your way, sorry for the trespass." He started to stand and Eli, without knowing exactly why, without understanding the mechanics of the decision, without having any memory of choosing to, said, "Wait." The stranger paused. He looked back at Eli over his shoulder with those unhurried amber eyes, and the morning light came through the slatted barn wall in long diagonal lines and landed across his face in a pattern that Eli thought, stupidly, absurdly, looked like something a painter might have arranged on purpose. "You hungry?" Eli asked. Something shifted in the stranger's expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, something that lived in the same neighborhood. "Yeah," he said, "I am." His name was River Holt. He told Eli this over eggs and black coffee at the kitchen table, sitting across from Eli in the early morning quiet of the Calloway Ranch house. The kitchen smelled the way it always had, of cast iron and wood smoke and the ghost of every meal that had ever been cooked in it, and Eli found himself watching River Holt eat with a kind of helpless attentiveness that he kept having to consciously redirect. River ate carefully, Eli noticed, not like a man who was starving, even though he probably was. He cut things into pieces. He didn't speak with his mouth full. He looked up at Eli occasionally when he talked, making eye contact with a directness that most people reserved for arguments or confessions, not for ordinary breakfast conversation. "You from around here?" Eli asked. "No," River said. He drank his coffee black without commenting on the fact that Eli had made it strong enough to resurface a driveway. "Originally from Colorado, the mountain part up near Gunnison, but I've been moving around for a couple years now." "Moving around, why?" River looked at him, not offended, not guarded, just looking. "Looking for work mostly. I know horses, I know cattle, I know fencing and irrigation and everything that goes with land like this." He glanced out the kitchen window at the dry gold spread of the Calloway acreage baking already in the early light. "Looks like you've got a lot of land." 1,200 acres, Eli said. Used to have more hands, down to just me now. River's eyes came back to him. Just you. Just me. A beat of silence that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite uncomfortable. River set his coffee cup down. You hearing? Eli looked at him for a long moment. River Holt sat across from him at his grandmother's kitchen table with his worn duffel bag on the floor beside his chair and his drifter's history written in the old scars on his hands and the road-quiet steadiness of his eyes. And Eli thought about every reasonable, logical, careful reason why he should say no. He had known this man for approximately 45 minutes. He didn't have a resume. He didn't have references. He had been asleep in Eli's barn at 2 in the morning. Yeah, Eli said, I am. The cabin at the east end of the property had been empty for 2 years. It was a small structure, one room, a narrow bed, a wood stove, a single window that faced the horse pasture and let in the evening light in long orange bars. It had been used last by a hand named Marcus who had worked the ranch for 11 years before his knees gave out and he retired to live with his daughter in San Antonio. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood and the faint ghost of Marcus's pipe tobacco, which had soaked itself so thoroughly into the walls that Eli sometimes thought it would outlast the building itself. He helped River carry a set of clean bedding down from the house, and they made up the narrow bed together in a silence that felt companionable rather than awkward, River tucking the corners with a practiced efficiency that suggested he had made more beds in temporary places than he could probably count. It's not much, Eli said, standing back and looking at the cabin with the self-conscious uncertainty of someone suddenly aware that what they're offering might fall short. It's more than I had last night, River said simply. He said it without self-pity, without the kind of false cheerfulness that people sometimes use to make others feel better about offering them something modest. He just said it as a fact, straightforwardly, the way he seemed to say most things. And somehow that matter-of-fact quality made Eli feel not guilty but grateful that this stranger had the particular kind of dignity that didn't require anyone to perform feelings they didn't have. All right, Eli said, I'll see you at first light then. First light, River agreed. Eli turned to leave. He had gotten 2 steps toward the door when River said, Hey, Calloway. He turned back. River was looking at him with those amber eyes, calm and direct as always, with something in them that Eli couldn't quite decipher, something warm and a little complicated, like a question that hadn't finished forming itself yet. Thank you, River said, for the eggs and the roof. Eli nodded once. He turned back to the door. He walked out into the cooling evening air and across the dry grass toward the main house, and he did not look back, and he was not entirely certain why his heart was doing the particular thing it was doing, beating a little too quickly, a little too loud, like it had something it was trying to tell him that he wasn't ready to hear. River Holt worked like he had something to prove, but not in the way that made you tired to watch. Some men, when they were trying to earn their place, made their effort visible. They grunted louder than necessary, they pointed out what they'd accomplished, they moved with the performed urgency of a man auditioning for a role. River was nothing like that. He simply worked with a focused, quiet intensity that made everything around him seem a little calmer, a little more ordered. Like the ranch itself was settling into a more comfortable arrangement in response to his presence. By the end of the first week, Eli had stopped feeling like he needed to supervise. By the end of the second, he had started to feel something else, something more complicated and considerably more inconvenient. It started, as these things often do, with something small. A Tuesday morning in early June, the temperature already climbing toward brutal before 8 o'clock. Eli was working a section of broken fence line along the northwest pasture, hammering new posts into the cracked earth with the mechanical rhythm of a man who had done it 1,000 times. He heard River coming before he saw him, the soft thud of boots on dry ground, unhurried and even. And then River was beside him, wordlessly picking up the post-hole digger that Eli had been alternating with the sledgehammer, and they fell into a rhythm together that Eli hadn't expected, hadn't planned for, but that felt so natural that it took him a full 5 minutes to notice they were doing it, trading off, one working while the other rested, anticipating each other's movements without having to discuss it. They worked like that for 2 hours in the climbing heat without saying much. The kind of quiet that builds up between two people who are comfortable enough not to fill the air. Eli kept catching himself glancing sideways at River, at the line of his profile against the white Texas sky, at the way his hands moved with easy confidence around the tools, at the way sweat darkened the back of his collar and the small damp crescent at his temple. He would catch himself looking and he would look away, and then, a few minutes later, he would look again. You do this your whole life? River asked eventually, without stopping what he was doing, without looking up. "Since I was 8, Eli said. My dad had me out here as soon as I could lift a hammer." "Your dad's still around?" A small pause, the sledgehammer came down. "No, 2 years ago, heart attack." River glanced at him then, briefly, and there was something in that glance that wasn't pity. Eli wouldn't have been able to tolerate pity, but was something quieter and more respectful. Acknowledgement, maybe. The simple recognition that loss was real and didn't require commentary. "Mine too," River said. "3 years ago, not a heart attack, but gone." He left the specifics deliberately unspecified, and Eli understood instinctively that this was not evasion but privacy, and that they were not yet at the stage where privacy gave way. "Is that why you started drifting?" Eli asked. River set the digger down, stood upright, stretched the muscles of his lower back with his hands pressed to his hips. He looked out across the pasture for a moment, at the dry gold land and the wavering heat haze on the horizon. "Partly," he said, "partly other things." Eli nodded. He didn't push. He picked up the sledgehammer and brought it down and felt the impact travel up through his arms and into his shoulders, and he thought about the phrase "partly other things" and the deliberate, careful way River had said it, and the specific way a person learns to keep pieces of themselves back when they've discovered that the world doesn't always handle those pieces gently. He knew something about that. The days settled into a rhythm. There is a particular pleasure in shared labor that people who have never done it don't quite understand. It isn't only about the work getting done faster, though there was that. It was something more fundamental. The way physical effort shared created a kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with trust. You learned a person through working beside them. You learned their pace, their instincts, their particular way of responding when something went wrong. You learned whether they complained or stayed quiet, whether they cut corners when they thought no one was watching, whether they took their time with things that mattered or rushed through to be done. Eli learned that River did not cut corners. He learned that River had an almost obsessive attention to detail when it came to the horses, that he spent extra time after his required duties just standing at the fence and watching them move, learning their individual gaits and moods and tendencies, quietly building a map of each animal's personality that was more thorough than anything Eli had ever compiled despite having grown up with these horses. He learned that River woke before first light every morning without an alarm, that he made his own coffee in the cabin, and drank it on the small front step before coming to the main barn, and that he did this solitary ritual regardless of what the weather was doing, rain, still, heat, the thunderous purple mornings that rolled in off the hills in early June. He sat on that step in the pre-dawn dark, and was quiet with himself in a way that Eli found himself envying with an intensity that surprised him. He learned that River laughed rarely, but when he did it transformed his face completely, the careful, composed expression cracking open into something unguarded and bright and young, the amber eyes crinkling at the corners, and the sound of it low and warm and utterly genuine. Eli was hearing that laugh more often as June rolled into the deep green gold of July. He was not sure what to do about that. The evening that changed things the first time, the initial shift, was a Thursday in mid-July. They had spent the afternoon dealing with a section of irrigation pipe that had partially collapsed under the main east field, a miserable, muddy, frustrating job that required lying flat on the ground and reaching into a narrow trench in the clay-heavy soil, working by feel in the dark earth to reconnect the broken joints. By the time they got it sorted and the water running again and climbed back to their feet, they were both covered in rust-red mud from the elbows down, and the sun was dropping fast toward the hills, turning the whole sky into something that looked almost embarrassingly beautiful. Eli rolled down his sleeves over the mud and reached for his hat, which he'd set on a fence post, and when he looked up, River was watching the sunset with an expression that Eli had never quite seen on him before. Not the composed, carefully managed expression of ordinary moments. Something open, something almost young, something that looked very much like longing. Eli watched him watching the sky. He thought, "I don't know anything about you. I don't know where you've been or what you're running from or what happened to you that made you learn how to keep yourself so quiet and contained. I don't know what you're looking for or whether you'll stay past September." He thought, "I want to know all of it." The thought arrived with a clarity that alarmed him, and he looked away quickly, focusing on pulling on his hat, on the completely ordinary task of adjusting the brim, as if the proper angle of a hat brim was a matter that required his entire cognitive attention. "That's something, isn't it?" River said quietly, still looking at the sky. "Yeah," Eli said, his voice came out roughly, "it is." River looked at him then, and for a moment their eyes met in the way they had been almost meeting and then sliding away from for the better part of 6 weeks, but this time for a single suspended beat of time neither of them looked away. The light was extraordinary. The kind of light that makes everything look significant. The kind of light that a person remembers afterward without being able to explain why. River looked away first. He reached for his own hat. "Better clean up before supper," he said. "Better," Eli agreed. And they walked back to the barn together in the evening light, not quite side by side, not quite one behind the other in that particular proximity that isn't yet closeness but is the room that closeness grows in. By August it had become a habit. Neither of them had arranged it or discussed it or given it a name. It had simply happened, the way things happen between people who are in each other's company long enough, the way patterns establish themselves as naturally as rivers find their lowest path downhill. After supper, on the evenings when neither of them was too exhausted to move, Eli would bring 2 bottles of cold beer out to the porch, and River would appear from the direction of the east cabin, and they would sit in the wooden chairs on the front porch of the main house and watch the evening happen around them. The porch faced west. They got the full performance of every sunset. They talked on those evenings. Not constantly. There were long stretches of comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that had texture to it that felt inhabited rather than empty. But they talked more over those August evenings than Eli had talked to anyone in the 2 years since his father died. And he talked about things he hadn't talked to anyone about. Things he had been carrying alone because there was no one to put them down with, and because he had not yet understood that the carrying was becoming a kind of habit of loneliness that was more familiar to him now than not being lonely. He talked about his father, about the particular specific weight of a grief that is also bound up with duty, about how, when Marcus Sr. died and left Eli the ranch, the grief had no space to breathe because there was immediately so much to manage, so many decisions that couldn't wait, so many people calling about mortgages and cattle prices and equipment leases. He talked about the year he had planned to spend in Austin before all of that happened. He had been accepted to study environmental science at UT. He had wanted to learn about water conservation, about sustainable land management, about making the kind of ranch his father had built work better for the land it sat on instead of just taking from it. "You gave that up?" River asked quietly. "I gave it up," Eli confirmed. "Do you regret it?" Eli was quiet for a moment, turning his beer bottle in his hands, watching the last of the red drain out of the sky. "I don't know. I think I gave it up without ever really deciding to. I just started responding to emergencies one after another, and then one day I looked up and I was just here, just running the ranch, and I don't know if I chose it or if it just happened to me." River was quiet for a beat. "Then, I think that's how most of our lives happen to us." Eli looked at him. "Is that what happened to you? Your life happened to you?" River's jaw tightened slightly, a small, careful movement. He took a slow drink of his beer. "In a way," he said, "I made some choices that felt necessary at the time, and then I made some choices that felt necessary because of those choices, and eventually I was just moving because stopping felt harder than moving." "What would you stop for?" Eli asked, "if you did stop?" The question hung between them in the warm August air, among the sounds of the insects and the occasional distant sound of a horse in the night pasture. River turned and looked at Eli with a directness that was different from his usual directness. Quieter somehow, more careful, like someone approaching something fragile from a particular angle so as not to startle it. "I'm not sure yet," River said. "I'm starting to get an idea." He said it simply. He didn't look away when he said it. And Eli felt his chest do something complicated and involuntary, a tightening that he recognized distantly as a thing he had felt before, but only once, only years ago, only in a context that he had spent a long time afterward carefully not thinking about. He looked away. He looked at the last stripe of orange on the horizon. "More beer," he said. "Sure," River said, and his voice was perfectly easy, perfectly unbothered, and either he had not meant what Eli thought he might have meant, or he had the particular quality of composure that allowed a person to say something significant and then simply wait, without urgency, without pressing, for the world to catch up. There was a night in the second week of August, a Wednesday. Eli would later remember this specifically, because the week had a particular shape to it and Wednesday was the hinge, when he woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of something in the west pasture. He came fully awake immediately, the way you do when you have been responsible for animals long enough that your sleeping mind develops a kind of alarm system separate from the rest of your consciousness. He was out of bed and pulling on jeans before the sound fully resolved itself. Not distress, he thought, not predator distress, but something else. A horse moving in an unusual pattern. He grabbed a flashlight and went out into the night. The Texas August night was dense and warm, the stars extravagant overhead, the air smelling of dried grass and something faintly sweet and indefinable that he associated with this particular time of year on this particular land. He crossed to the west pasture fence and found the source of the sound immediately. River was there already. He was standing in the pasture with one of the older mares, Juniper, who had been showing signs of stiffness in her left foreleg for the past week. She stood with her nose pressed against River's chest, completely still, while River's hands moved over her neck and shoulder with slow, firm strokes. He was speaking to her, too quietly for Eli to hear the words, just a low murmur of sound, and Juniper's eyes were half closed in that particular expression of equine relaxation that Eli knew well, the expression that meant, "You are safe, I am safe, everything is fine." Eli stood at the fence for a moment before River heard him. "She was uncomfortable," River said without turning around. "I heard her from the cabin." "You heard her from the cabin," Eli repeated, a little disbelieving. The cabin was 200 yards from this pasture. "Light sleeper," River said. He finally glanced back and there was a faint smile in his expression that the moonlight made difficult to read completely. "Opposite of you." Eli climbed through the fence rails and came to stand beside River. Juniper moved her nose from River's chest to investigate Eli's jacket pocket, looking for the apple slices Eli sometimes kept there. He didn't have any tonight, and she made a sound of mild bovine disapproval and went back to pressing her nose against River. "She likes you," Eli said. "Horses usually do," River said, not arrogantly, just as a fact. "I think they can tell when you're not performing for them." "What does that mean?" River thought about it for a moment, still moving his hand along Juniper's neck. Some people are very deliberate around horses, very aware of themselves. They're thinking about technique, about what they're supposed to do, about how they look doing it. And horses feel all of that, all that self-consciousness. He paused. "I stopped being self-conscious a while ago. I think that's why they trust me." Eli stood beside him in the warm dark and the extraordinary stars and said, "What did it take to stop being self-conscious?" River's hand stilled briefly, just briefly, then it resumed its slow movement. "Losing things," he said quietly, "losing things that I was afraid to lose and finding out that the losing didn't kill me." They stood together with Juniper in the night pasture for a long time after that, not saying anything. The stars moved their slow, imperceptible arc overhead. Juniper eventually lowered her head to graze and the two men stood there on either side of her in the dark, close enough that Eli could feel the warmth radiating from River's shoulder, not quite touching, with the whole huge quiet night around them, and Eli thought, "I am not unhappy right now. I am in fact the opposite of unhappy, and I don't know what to do with that." They walked back separately, Eli to the house, River to the east cabin. Eli lay in his bed in the dark for a long time before he slept. The trouble, when it came, arrived in a silver pickup truck on a Friday morning in late August. Cole Marsh was 25, handsome in the uncomplicated way that made life easy for people, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having had a reason to be otherwise. He was the son of Harold Marsh of the Rocking M Ranch, which bordered the Callaway property to the east, and he had been a peripheral figure in Eli's life for as long as Eli could remember, there in the background of county events and cattle auctions and occasional fence line disputes, always pleasant, always just a little too conscious of his own pleasantness. He came with a bucket of fresh peaches from his mother's orchard, a peace offering for that fence business last spring, he said, which had been a minor boundary dispute that Eli had already forgotten. And he stayed for coffee, which Eli offered out of the basic social courtesy that ranch life in rural Texas demanded. And he spotted River through the kitchen window while Eli was filling the coffee pot and asked, "Who's that?" Eli followed his gaze. River was working in the near paddock with the young gray gelding, working on transitions, moving the horse through its paces with quiet, precise signals that the gelding was responding to with increasing confidence. Even from this distance, through the kitchen glass, the fluid quality of River's horsemanship was visible, the economy of movement, the absence of wasted gesture. "That's River Holt," Eli said. "He's been helping me out since June." "Huh," Cole said, watching. Something in his expression shifted slightly, a kind of interested appraisal that Eli noticed and felt an immediate, instinctive, and wholly unwelcome response to. "I didn't know you'd hired someone new. Where's he from?" Colorado, Eli said. He turned away from the window and focused on the coffee. Cole came to the paddock with Eli after coffee, carrying one of the remaining peaches and eating it in slow, contented bites while River finished his work with the gray gelding. River noticed them at the fence and brought the horse to a halt, walking him over with the easy authority of someone perfectly comfortable in the role they occupied. Cole introduced himself with the automatic warmth of someone who had been raised to make introductions. He said, "That gray looking good, you've been working him long?" 3 weeks, River said. He had that quality he always had with new people, not cold, not unfriendly, but calibrated as if he was watching and measuring before he decided what to offer. He was resistant to transitions. He's coming around. "You're good," Cole said, simply and directly. And then he smiled, a wide, uncalculated smile that transformed his face the way that kind of easy confidence tends to. "Really good. Where'd you train?" "Around," River said. Cole laughed, apparently finding this charming. He stayed another 40 minutes, leaning on the fence and talking with the comfortable fluency of a man who was accustomed to conversations going well for him. And Eli stood beside him and participated in the conversation and felt, with increasing clarity, a particular feeling that sat in his chest like something with weight to it, something dense and unhappy, a feeling that he recognized in the distant, abstract way that a person recognizes a weather pattern before they've yet felt the rain. He was jealous. Not of Cole's ease or his good looks or his unbothered confidence, though those things were mildly aggravating in the specific way that effortlessness aggravates people who have had to work for everything. No, what Eli was jealous of was the way Cole was looking at River, with open, uncalculated interest, with the specific quality of attention that said, "I see something here that I want to understand better." Because that was exactly the way Eli had been looking at River for the past 2 months, except Eli had been careful. Except Eli had been managing it, containing it, looking away when the looking went on too long, redirecting his attention to the next task, to the fence line or the water level or the feed schedule. Eli had been doing all of this careful, exhausting work of containment, and here was Cole Marsh, eating a peach and leaning on a fence rail and simply looking. Simply not bothering to contain himself at all. It was, Eli thought, a deeply uncomfortable feeling. Cole came back the following Tuesday. And then again the Thursday after that. He was always arriving with some pretext. A question about the east fence line, a recommendation for a local vet, a piece of equipment he thought Eli might want to borrow. The pretexts were thin and everyone knew they were thin, including, Eli thought, River, who received Cole's visits with the same careful, composed watchfulness he gave everything, without warmth but without coldness, with that particular quality of measured attention that might have been interest or might have been something else entirely. Eli watched this from various distances and felt the weight in his chest grow steadily heavier. He couldn't explain it to himself in terms he was ready to use yet. He couldn't say, "I am jealous because River is something to me that I have not yet admitted even to myself, because admitting it would require me to also admit things about myself that I have been not admitting for a very long time." He couldn't say that. He couldn't say any of it, not even inside his own head in the privacy of his own thoughts. What he could do and what he did was become more distant. It happened gradually, the way most changes do, in increments small enough that no single moment was identifiable as the turning point. He was less available for the evening porch sessions. He found reasons to be busy, to be in other parts of the property, to eat earlier or later, to be already in the house and not emerging when he heard River's footsteps on the path from the east cabin. He told himself he was just tired. He told himself it was the heat. He told himself a great many things that he didn't quite believe, and he kept his distance, and he watched Cole Marsh's silver truck appear and disappear from his property with a feeling in his chest that he refused to diagnose. River noticed. Of course River noticed. River noticed everything with those quiet amber eyes that missed very little. He didn't comment on it directly, that wasn't his way, but Eli caught him watching sometimes with an expression that was more complicated than his usual composed steadiness. A faint line between his brows, a quality of waiting. And then came the evening of the first week of September. The storm came in from the southwest with almost no warning, which was not unusual in the Texas Hill Country, where weather could reverse itself in 20 minutes and a clear sky could produce violence with very little preamble. Eli saw the front coming around 5 in the afternoon, the specific greenish tinge at the horizon that experienced ranchers learn to recognize and respect, and he was already moving toward the near barn to get the horses in when River appeared from the direction of the east field, apparently having seen the same thing from whatever vantage point he'd been at. They worked fast, side by side, moving the horses from the pastures into the stalls with the urgency of practiced efficiency. The two of them fitting together in the task the way they had learned to fit together in all the physical work of the ranch, anticipating each other's movements, trading off, communicating in the short verbal code that had developed naturally over months of shared labor. The storm hit while they were still securing the last stall. It hit hard and all at once, the way Texas storms did, a wall of wind, then rain that came down not in drops but in sheets, in solid hammering curtains of water that reduced visibility to almost nothing, and turned the yard outside the barn door into a churning red mud river in about 90 seconds. They stood in the doorway of the barn and watched it for a moment, both of them breathing hard from the exertion of getting the horses in, both of them getting wet from the spray that the wind was driving sideways through the opening. "That's something," Eli said. "That's something," River agreed. They were close together in the barn doorway because the doorway wasn't wide enough for two people to stand at a comfortable social distance and also watch a storm. Close enough that Eli could feel the warmth of River's arm against his own, could hear him breathing. Close enough that if either of them had turned, their faces would have been very near. Eli did not turn. They watched the storm in silence for a while. The horses were restless behind them, moving in their stalls, and River, without looking away from the rain, reached back with one hand and rested it briefly on the nearest horse's nose, Juniper again, always Juniper, in a calming gesture that was so automatic it seemed to be part of his resting state. Eli, River said. His voice was different, not dramatically different, but different enough that Eli felt it register somewhere below his conscious mind, a subtle shift in tone that his body responded to before his brain had processed the word. "Yeah," Eli said, not looking at him. "Are you angry at me for something?" Eli was quiet. Outside, the storm did what storms do. It raged and hammered and made the trees in the distance bend in anguished arcs. "No," Eli said. "You've been avoiding me," River said, not an accusation. A fact stated with the same directness he used for everything. "I've been busy." A pause, Eli. Something about the way River said his name, just that, just his name, with a quality of steady, patient insistence, made Eli's jaw tighten, made something behind his sternum do something uncomfortable and clarifying. "Cole Marsh has been coming around a lot," Eli said. He had not planned to say it. He heard himself say it with a kind of distant surprise, like a man who has been startled into saying the thing he actually means by the sheer force of someone looking at him too directly. Another pause, longer this time. The rain was extraordinary. "Yeah," River said carefully, "he has." "Seems like he likes you," Eli said. His voice came out flat and very even, in the way voices go flat when the speaker is working to keep them under control. "Seems like," River agreed, something careful in his tone. "And you," Eli stopped. He couldn't finish it. He didn't know how to finish it without finishing a great many other things at the same time, without pulling threads that were attached to things he wasn't ready to unravel. He felt River turn beside him, felt the shift in weight. The change in the direction of his attention. He could feel River looking at him, even though he wasn't looking back. Even though he was staring at the rain with the fixed determination of a man who needs something steady to look at. "And me what?" River said quietly. Eli said nothing. "Eli, look at me." He didn't want to. He knew that if he looked at River right now, in this specific moment, with the storm outside and the barn dark and close and the horses restless behind them and River standing this near and using that tone, he knew that if he looked at River he was going to say something or not say something. And either way something was going to become irreversible. He looked at River. River was watching him with those amber eyes, and they were not composed in the way they usually were. They were searching open with something in them that was not at all the managed calm of ordinary moments. Something more alive, more urgent, more like a person who has been patient for a long time and has reached the outer edge of patience not in frustration but in necessity, in the specific necessity that arises when something true can no longer be kept waiting. "Cole Marsh is a nice man," River said quietly. "He's easy to talk to and he means well and he's been very clear about being interested." He paused. "I've been clear back." Eli's jaw tightened. "Clear back." "Clear that I'm not available," River said. The rain hammered the roof. A horse shifted in its stall. Eli's heart was doing something specific and emphatic and impossible to ignore. "Not available," he repeated, hearing his own voice as if from a slight distance. "Not in the way he's interested," River said, "because I'm," he stopped. He took a breath that was not quite steady, because there's something else that I'm interested in that I've been interested in for a while now. He did not look away from Eli. He had the quality now not of composure but of courage, of someone who has decided to say the true thing regardless of where it lands. And I don't know if I don't know if it's I don't know what you're dealing with, or what you're ready for. And I've been trying to be patient and give you room because you have the right to take all the room you need. His voice was very low. But I can't watch you avoid me anymore and not say something. Eli was looking at him. Storm was doing its full and magnificent worst outside, all thunder and hard rain and the smell of lightning in the air. And Eli was looking at River Holt in the barn doorway, and thinking about the morning in the kitchen with the eggs, and the particular way the light had caught the old scars on his hands, and the moment in the west pasture with Juniper in the dark, and every porch evening in August with the 2 bottles of cold beer, and the easy comfortable quality of the silences between them, and he thought, I have been running from this the entire time, and I am so tired of running. River, he said. Yeah. I don't know how to, I've never, he started again. There's things about me that I haven't, that I've spent a lot of time not exactly, he exhaled. I'm not good at this. I know, River said, and there was something in his voice, not condescension, not impatience, something unbearably gentle. I know, I'm not either. I've had more practice keeping things back than letting them out. A pause. But I think maybe we've been keeping each other company in that a little, in the keeping things back. Eli looked at him for a long time. The rain was beginning to ease slightly, the first sharp violence of the storm giving way to steady rain, the sky outside lightening from green dark to gray silver. Yeah, Eli said finally, quietly, I think we have. River didn't move forward, he didn't press. He just kept looking at Eli with those warm and searching amber eyes, and the space between them in the barn doorway was charged with something that hadn't been there before or had been there all along and was only now being named. Okay, River said after a while very simply. Okay, Eli said. They stood there in the doorway until the rain dropped to a fine mist and the world outside turned silver and dripping and new-smelling, the way the world always does after a hard rain. And they didn't say anything more. But something had changed in the specific, permanent way that things change when words have been used to make true things visible. When they walked back to their respective sleeping places, River to the east cabin, Eli to the main house, they did not walk in the particular proximity of almost closeness that had characterized the past weeks. They walked for the first time side by side, close enough that their arms almost touched, not hiding from what the space between them had been holding. Eli lay awake that night for a long time, but it was different from the other nights. It wasn't anxious. It was the wakeful feeling of someone on the edge of something large looking at it for the first time with their eyes fully open. The 2 days after the storm were the most careful and most vivid of Eli Calloway's adult life. There are moments in a life, most people get a handful of them at most, where everything becomes temporarily hyperreal, where the ordinary textures of daily existence sharpen to a quality of presence that makes the regular world feel, in retrospect, like a draft of something that you've now been handed the final, printed version of. The morning after the barn conversation, Eli woke to ordinary ranch sounds, the horses, the roosters, the distant lowing of the cattle in the south pasture, and everything felt different, not changed, clarified. He made coffee, he heard River's boots on the path from the east cabin. He opened the kitchen door before River could knock. River looked at him. Eli looked at River. Something quiet passed between them that wasn't words, that was made entirely of the history of the past 3 months, of all the evenings and the fence lines and the night in the dark pasture and the storm, all of it compressed into a single moment of eye contact that lasted 3 seconds longer than eye contact usually lasted between them. Morning, River said. Morning, Eli said, coffee's ready. River came inside. They had breakfast at the kitchen table, the same as always. They talked about the work that the storm had left behind. There were branches down in the east field, and the creek that ran along the northern property boundary had probably risen enough to require checking. Ordinary things, practical things. And yet everything had a faint glow of significance that Eli was aware of without quite being able to locate it in any specific gesture or word. It was in the pace of the morning, in the way neither of them was in a hurry, in the quality of the pauses in conversation, in the fact that when River reached across the table to turn the coffee pot handle toward himself, and his hand passed close to Eli's, neither of them jerked back. They went to work. They checked the creek, risen but not over its banks. They cleared the branches. They replaced a section of fence that the wind had loosened, all ordinary, all the things they had been doing for 3 months. but they were different with each other. Not dramatically, not in the way of scenes or declarations, just differently comfortable in the way that being honest about something makes you more comfortable in the space you share, even when the honesty has raised more questions than it's answered, even when there are still many things unsaid, many things that will need time and privacy and the courage to keep being honest. They talked more. They had always talked, but now they talked differently with less of the careful management, less of the deliberate sidestepping that Eli, at least, had been performing. River told him more about Colorado, about growing up in a small mountain town where everybody knew everything about everybody and the knowing was sometimes a comfort and sometimes a cage. He talked about his father, a little more, about a man who had been loving and limited in specific ways that River had spent years trying to reconcile, who had given River his love of horses and land and his difficulty with things he didn't understand, and who had died before River could finish the reconciling. Eli listened to all of this with the particular attention he now understood he had been giving River for months without knowing what to call it. In return, he told River things he had not told anyone. About the year before his father died, when they had argued about the ranch's future, about the debt load that Marcus Sr. had accumulated through a drought period and hadn't fully shared with Eli, about the specific, devastating way that grief was complicated by anger, and anger by love when the person you were angry at was no longer there to hear it. "Do you still feel the anger?" River asked. They were sitting on the front porch. The evening was September cool, the first real coolness of the season, the air carrying that particular note that meant the worst of the summer was done. "Sometimes," Eli said honestly, "less than I did, but sometimes." River nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think anger at someone you love is one of the hardest things to carry, because you can't put it down without it feeling like a betrayal and you can't keep carrying it without it doing damage." Eli looked at him. "Did you carry it with your dad?" River exhaled slowly. "I carried other things with him," he said carefully. Things he couldn't quite." He paused, started again. "He didn't know how to hold all of who I was. He wanted to, I believe that, but he didn't know how." A pause. "I spent a long time being angry about that, and then a long time being sad about it, and then," he looked out at the evening, "and then he died and I was in a different place with it, not resolved, just different. I miss him. And I'm still working through the rest of it." Eli sat with this for a while. He understood, distantly but not entirely without personal resonance, what River was describing. He thought about the things he himself had not known how to hold about himself, the things he had managed through distance and work and an extremely curated inner silence. "River," he said carefully. "Yeah. When you said, in the barn, when you said there was something you were interested in," he stopped. His heart was doing its thing again. "That was you meant." "You," River said quietly. "Yes." The word landed with a particular quality of directness and simplicity that made Eli's chest ache in a way that was not painful. Not painful, but acute. The kind of feeling that lives very near the border of pain and something else entirely. "I don't know how to do this," Eli said. His voice was low. I don't have a lot of experience with," he exhaled. "I've been telling myself things for a long time that I'm starting to think weren't true." River looked at him with those warm and patient eyes. "What things?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. The evening was very still. The horses were shadows in the near pasture. "That I was just careful," Eli said finally. "That I was just private. That the reason the reason things had never." He stopped. He tried again. "There was a person a long time ago when I was 17, and I felt something that I didn't understand, and I spent a long time making sure I didn't feel it anymore." River was very still beside him. "Did it work?" River asked quietly. A long pause. Eli turned and looked at him. "No," Eli said. River's expression did something then, something that moved through it like light through water, something warm and complicated and deeply, privately human. He looked at Eli with the kind of look that takes a long time to develop, that only exists after months of knowing someone and watching them and choosing them, quietly and repeatedly, in all the small ways that add up to something undeniable. I know you need time," River said. "I'm not in a hurry." "You don't have to be patient with me," Eli said a little roughly. "I want to be," River said simply. "That's different from having to." Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then, very carefully, he reached over and put his hand over River's where it rested on the arm of the chair. Just that, just his hand over River's. River's hand warm and still, the old scars of his knuckles familiar now, the weight of his palm steady and real under Eli's. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars appear over the dark hills, and neither of them spoke, and Eli felt something in his chest that he had no map for, something large and tentative and real, and he thought, oh, this is what I've been keeping myself from. 3 days of careful, new tenderness. 3 days of learning what it meant to occupy the same space as another person differently, with awareness, with the particular heightened consciousness that comes when you have named something and have not yet learned to be easy with the name. 3 days of their ordinary work transformed by the invisible change between them, the way the same room looks different after it has been repainted, even if the color is nearly identical to what it was before. And then Cole Marsh came back. He came on a Wednesday morning, as he sometimes did, and he had another pretext, something about borrowing a post-hole digger, which Eli had and Cole certainly didn't actually need. He found them in the near barn, Eli working on a piece of tack that needed restitching, River nearby cleaning and organizing the tool wall with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. Cole's eyes went to River immediately, they always did. He was pleasant, as always, he talked easily, the way he always did. He mentioned a dance coming up at the county fairgrounds the following Saturday, a late summer tradition, music and food, most of the county showing up. He mentioned it generally, theoretically, and then he mentioned it specifically. You should come, River, he said, casually, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to make invitations sound like suggestions so they were easier to say yes to. It's a good time, I go every year, I could show you around, introduce you to some people. Eli, bent over the tack stitching with his back partially to both of them, felt the weight in his chest return. He said nothing. He kept stitching. He was aware with acute peripheral attention of River standing at the tool wall, of the precise quality of the pause before River answered. Thanks for the offer, River said. His voice was pleasant and even, but I think Eli and I already have plans that weekend. Eli did not move. He kept his eyes on the tack. He heard Cole absorb this, a brief, calibrated pause, the recalibration of a man who was skilled at social dynamics and understood in that pause something that hadn't been explicitly said. Oh, Cole said evenly, sure, no problem. Another pause, and then to his credit and perhaps because he was genuinely a decent man under the easy confidence. Well, have a good weekend then. He picked up the post-hole digger and left, and his silver truck disappeared down the long ranch road toward the county highway, and the barn was quiet. Eli sat with the tack in his lap and did not look up for a moment. Then he said very quietly, we don't have plans Saturday. We could, River said. Eli looked up. River was looking at him from across the barn, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression carrying that quality of composed patience that Eli now understood was not cold distance but a very disciplined form of warmth, the warmth of someone who had learned to hold things carefully because he'd seen what happened when you didn't. What did you have in mind? Eli said. Something moved in River's expression. The closest thing to a smile he gave in ordinary moments, not the transforming laugh smile but the smaller, private one, the one that lived at the corner of his mouth and in the slight warmth of his eyes. There's a place, River said, up in the north section of the property. I found it a few weeks ago, a creek bend with old cottonwoods. It's something in the evening. Eli looked at him for a long moment. You've been exploring the property. I have, River confirmed without apology. On your own time. On my own time. Eli shook his head slightly. He looked back down at the tack, but the small movement at the corner of his own mouth betrayed him. Saturday evening, he said. Saturday evening, River agreed. Saturday came the way Saturdays do in early September in Texas, hot in the afternoon, cooling towards something like grace as the sun dropped. They rode out to the north section on horseback at about 6 in the evening, when the light had gone golden, and the shadows of the live oak stretched long and purple across the dry grass. Eli rode his horse, a deep bay quarter horse named Casper, whose original owner had clearly been either very imaginative or very literal depending on how you looked at it. River rode the gray gelding he'd been working with all summer, who had progressed remarkably under River's patient attention and now moved with an easy confidence that was a pleasure to watch. The creek bend in the north section was as River had described it. The cottonwoods were old, with the particular massive, authoritative presence of trees that have been standing in one place for a century, their trunks nearly 4 feet across, their canopies wide enough to create real shade even at this time of year. The creek was low from the summer drought but still running clear over smooth stones. And the bend it made created a kind of natural amphitheater that caught the evening light in a specific way, warm and enclosing, private, with the sound of moving water and the sound of wind through cottonwood leaves, which was different from all other wind sounds, lighter and more silvery. They tied the horses and sat on the bank, and Eli understood immediately why River had come back to this place. They were quiet for a while, the good kind of quiet. "How did you find this?" Eli asked eventually. "I was checking the north fence line," River said. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees looking at the water. "Followed the creek for a while, came around the bend and found this." A pause. "I thought about telling you when I first found it, but we weren't," he stopped. "We were in the difficult part," Eli said. "We were in the difficult part," River agreed. Eli looked at him, the evening light on his profile, the set of his jaw, the particular architecture of his face that Eli had spent months learning, in the same way you learn a landscape you live in, not formally, not with intention, but through the accumulation of daily looking until the thing becomes part of the map inside your head. "Can I ask you something?" Eli said. "Yeah." "What made you stay here at the Callaway Ranch? You could have moved on months ago. You've got enough experience to find work anywhere." River was quiet for a moment. A cottonwood leaf drifted down onto the surface of the creek and moved away on the current. "A few things," River said carefully. "The work is good, the land is," he searched for the word. "The land has character. I like land that has character." He paused. "And there was something else I wanted to see how it developed." "Something else?" Eli said. River turned and looked at him then, directly and with no attempt at management, with the full weight of those amber eyes that had caught Eli off guard on a June morning that felt simultaneously like yesterday and like the beginning of a different life. He said simply, "I wanted to see how you developed." Eli held his gaze for a long moment. "How am I doing?" he said, and his voice was rougher than intended. River's expression did the thing, the private, corner-of-the-mouth thing, the small, warm thing that was its own kind of answer. "Better," River said, "every day a little better." Eli exhaled. He turned back to the water. He said after a while, "I've spent a lot of time being scared of myself." River said nothing, just listened. "Of the parts of myself that I didn't think had, that I wasn't sure had room here, in this life, on this ranch in this county, in the version of Eli Callaway that the last 2 years built." He paused. "It's a small community. People know everything about everybody. My dad was a particular kind of man, well respected, and his son running the Callaway Ranch. There's a kind of weight to that image that I've been trying to live inside of." "Is that image true?" River asked quietly. "Some of it," Eli said. "The parts about the work, about the land, about trying to do it right, those are true. Other parts," he was quiet for a moment. "I've been fitting myself inside a shape that didn't quite fit, and it's you get used to being uncomfortable in your own shape. After a while you stop noticing." "Until something makes you notice," River said. "Until something makes you notice," Eli agreed. He looked sideways at River. River was looking at him with that warm, quiet, completely undefended expression, and Eli thought about the particular kind of courage it took to look at someone that openly, to not hide behind composure or coolness, to simply let yourself be seen looking, to offer your own visibility without knowing if it would be met. Eli was not good at that kind of courage. He had spent years armoring himself in quiet and work and the daily maintenance of a ranch that needed him and therefore gave him no time to need anything back. He had gotten very good at not needing things back. "I'm working on it," he said quietly, "the fitting myself right, being a shape that's actually mine." "I know," River said, "I can see it. It's uncomfortable." "Yeah," River said, "it is, and then it stops being uncomfortable." He paused. "At least that's what I'm told. I'm still in the uncomfortable part myself." They looked at each other. And then something happened that neither of them had planned or arranged or moved toward with any calculation at all. Something that was simply the natural outcome of two people sitting close together in a beautiful place in the last light of a September evening, having said the things that needed to be said over the course of a long summer of learning each other. River reached over and put his hand against Eli's jaw, just the lightest pressure of his palm against the rough stubble of Eli's cheek, and turned his face gently toward him. And Eli, who had spent 2 years not wanting anything and the last 3 months wanting this specifically, and trying to contain it, Eli let himself be turned. The evening light was extraordinary. The cottonwood leaves were silver. The creek made its small, steady, ancient sound. Fade to black. There is a particular quality to early mornings in September in the Texas Hill Country, a softness to the light, a coolness to the air that carries the first real suggestion of autumn, a stillness that feels like the land is exhaling after the long labor of summer. Eli woke early on the Sunday morning. He lay in his bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular quality of the morning differently than he had felt any recent morning. There was something in his chest that he took a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar enough to require identification, something open, something with space in it, something that felt like what relief might feel like if relief had been building for 22 years. He made coffee. He opened the front door before the knock. River was standing on the porch with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking out at the morning, and when he turned and looked at Eli, there was something in his face that was different from the careful composure of ordinary mornings, something warmer, something less managed, something that sat closer to the surface. "Morning," Eli said. "Morning," River said. Eli handed him a coffee. River took it. They stood on the porch together in the early light looking out at the Callaway land, the 1,200 acres in its September gold, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the best silence Eli could remember. "I want to talk to you about something," River said eventually. Something in Eli's chest tightened reflexively, the old, practiced reflex of a person who has learned that revelations are often difficult. "Okay," he said. "I've been thinking about the thing you said, about fitting yourself inside a shape that doesn't fit." River wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I've been doing my own version of that. I've been using the moving around as a way of not having to fit, not having to be a fixed thing that someone could actually see completely." He paused. "Because when you're always moving, you can curate what you show. You can be a temporary version of yourself, and a temporary version is easier to manage." And Eli said carefully. River looked at him sideways. "And I think I'd like to try being something less temporary if the situation allowed." Eli looked at him for a long moment. "Are you asking if you can stay?" River met his gaze steadily. "I'm telling you what I'd like and giving you complete room to tell me what you need." This was, Eli thought, such a perfectly River thing to say, to offer himself that clearly and that honestly while simultaneously building the other person a door to leave through if they needed it, to make himself vulnerable without making the vulnerability a demand. "I'd like you to stay," Eli said. And because he was learning to fit himself into a shape that was actually his, learning to let the inside things be outside things occasionally, "I'd like you to stay more than I know how to say yet." River looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face, something that wasn't quite the laugh smile and wasn't quite the private corner smile, but was something that seemed to encompass both, something larger than either. "Then I'll stay," River said simply. October came to the Callaway Ranch in the way autumn comes to Texas Hill Country, gently incrementally, the temperature dropping in slow, considered degrees rather than the dramatic overnight reversals of more northerly places. The live oaks held their leaves as they always did, being live oaks and therefore seasonally stubborn. But the grasses shifted color and the light changed its angle, and the whole property had a quality in October that it hadn't had in September, a kind of settled substantial beauty, as if the land had stopped performing for summer and had given itself permission to simply be. Things between Eli and River settled too in their own way, not dramatically or overnight. In the manner of everything real, slowly, with the texture of actual days, of mornings that came with their own requirements and evenings that arrived with their own particular gifts. They were careful with each other in the way of people who know that something new and real and not fully shaped yet is in their hands, and who understand that the handling of new things requires attention. They were careful and they were honest, and they were sometimes clumsy, in the way of people who are learning to speak a language they've known the grammar of internally for a long time but have never spoken aloud before. Eli told his neighbor Ruth Harrington, who had known him since he was born and who had been quietly watching the Callaway Ranch with the particular attention of someone who loved it and the person running it, on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October when she came to help with the fall cattle count the way she always did. He didn't make a speech of it. He just said, in the course of conversation about the count and the cattle prices and the state of the north fence, that River would be staying on permanently and that it was more than a work arrangement. Ruth looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of someone who has known something was the case for longer than the person telling them has known it, and then she said, "Well, good." And then she said, "He handles Juniper like nobody I've ever seen." And that was that. Eli had been afraid of the telling in the abstract, formless way of someone who has never tested a fear against reality. The reality was Ruth saying, "Well, good," and asking if River would be joining them for the count. He called his cousin Danny in Austin the following week. Danny took longer to process, asked more questions, was silent for a stretch that felt somewhat like the stretch of the ranch road when you're driving it in fog and can't quite see where it ends. And then Danny said, "I mean, are you happy?" And Eli said, "Yeah, I am." And Danny said, "Then what am I gonna say? Come down and visit sometime, bring him." These were not nothing, these ordinary responses. To a person who has spent a long time imagining catastrophic reactions, ordinary responses were everything. There was a morning in late October that Eli would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because anything was said that hadn't been said, or because any new landmark was reached. It was simply an ordinary morning made of ordinary things that had acquired extraordinary value through the alchemy of being genuinely his own, being the actual shape of his actual life instead of the curated, managed approximation he had been living in. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the month's expense ledger open in front of him when River came in from the early barn check, still wearing his jacket, hair slightly damp from the October mist that had been sitting over the property since before dawn. He came in and went to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup and then came to the table and sat across from Eli, the way he had sat on that June morning 4 months ago, and he said nothing, just sat there with his coffee and his quiet presence while Eli worked through the ledger. After a while, River picked up the agricultural supplement that had been sitting on the corner of the table and started reading it. And they were just there together in the morning, in the kitchen that smelled of cast iron and wood smoke and the ghosts of 100,000 meals, with the October mist outside the windows and the horses in the near pasture, and 1,200 acres of hill country turning in its slow seasonal wheel. Eli looked up from the ledger and saw River reading, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup, his expression peacefully absorbed, and he felt in a way that was entirely undramatic and entirely complete that this was it. That this moment, this specific ordinary Tuesday October morning, was the shape of the life he actually wanted. Not a version of it, not an approximation, the thing itself. He looked back down at the ledger, he did the arithmetic. He was smiling slightly in a way he was not entirely aware of. River, without looking up from his supplement, said, "What?" "Nothing," Eli said. River glanced at him over the edge of the magazine briefly with those amber eyes, and then went back to reading. "Okay," River said, but he was smiling too, slightly, in the corner of his mouth, in the way Eli knew by now. The morning continued. By the first week of November, the Callaway Ranch had settled into its winter rhythms. The cattle had been moved to the winter pastures. The irrigation system had been winterized. The equipment had been serviced and stored. River had reorganized the north barn with a thoroughness that made Eli feel mildly ashamed of how he'd been managing it solo. And the horses were well and sleek, and Juniper's leg had improved considerably under a regime of regular massage and targeted exercise that River had developed with the same patient, systematic attention he brought to everything. They had settled into the cabin question. River's cabin at the east end of the property remained River's cabin. His space, his solitude, the place he could be alone in the way that Eli understood a person who had spent years drifting needed to be able to be alone sometimes. But there was an increasing frequency of nights when the path between the east cabin and the main house was used in both directions, when the spare room that had been a spare room all of Eli's life became, without drama or announcement, simply River's room when he chose to use it. It was not a rushed arrangement. It was the arrangement of two people who had both spent years alone learning to choose something other than alone, and who understood that the choosing had to be deliberate and daily and gradual rather than sudden, because the gradual things are the things that hold. Eli was not in November a different person from the person he had been in May. He was the same person. He still woke early and worked hard and worried about water levels and cattle prices and the north fence and the ever-present mathematics of keeping a 1,200-acre ranch financially viable on the proceeds of cattle and his father's careful savings and his own careful management. He was still quiet, still not given to speeches or performances, still more comfortable with physical labor and the honest company of animals than with most forms of social interaction. But he was also no longer the person who ran from himself, who had curated a version of Eli Callaway that fit inside a shape the world had handed him, and had lived inside that curated shape until it became a kind of exile. He was not that person anymore, or was becoming less that person every day in the daily practice of being honest, of letting the inside things be outside things, of saying what was true instead of what was safe. River, for his part, was not cured of the things that had set him moving, was not done with the long process of reconciling the complicated gifts and limitations of his father, was not suddenly a man without history or difficulty or the particular kind of reserve that long practice of protecting yourself carves into a person's bearing. He was still all of that, But he was not moving anymore. He was still. He was in one place, with his hands on the land and his eyes on the horizon and his morning coffee on the east cabin step in the November cold. And the stillness suited him in a way that was visible to everyone who saw him, in the way that water looks different when it's found its proper level. One evening in late November, they were on the porch after dinner, a habit that had continued into the cooling fall, simply bundled against the cold now rather than seeking the warmth of it. When River said, after a long, companionable silence, "Can I show you something?" Eli looked at him. "Right now." "Right now." They went inside, and River went to the canvas duffel bag that still lived in the corner of the spare room in the way of a person who hasn't quite let themselves fully unpack, and he reached into an interior pocket and brought out a small, worn notebook. He held it for a moment, and Eli watched his hands, those familiar hands, the old scars and the calluses and the particular way they held things, hold the notebook with an oddly careful quality, the quality of something that mattered. "I've been drawing," River said. He opened the notebook and handed it to Eli. Eli looked at the pages. They were pencil sketches, done with the compact set of pencils that Eli had noticed in River's jacket pocket once or twice and had not commented on. The drawings were of the ranch, of the land, the buildings, the horses, of specific moments: the creek bend with the cottonwoods in September light, Juniper with her nose pressed against the barn door, the view from the north fence line at dawn, the main house with its porch and the two chairs on it in the specific angle of afternoon shadow. And then, near the back of the notebook, a different subject. Eli working. Eli at the fence with the sledgehammer in profile against the sky, the particular angle of his hat and his shoulders visible in the economy of line. Eli at the kitchen table with his coffee and his ledger absorbed. Eli standing at the paddock fence watching the gray gelding move, arms folded, with the specific weight and quiet that River had apparently been watching closely enough to distill into a handful of pencil lines. Eli stood very still, looking at these drawings. He had never seen himself from the outside before. Not really. Not like this, not translated into the specific language of someone else's attention, someone else's seeing. He looked at the drawings of himself and felt something that was difficult to articulate precisely, but that lived in the neighborhood of being known, of being seen by someone who was paying attention, real attention, and reflecting what they saw back to you with care and without distortion. He closed the notebook carefully. He handed it back. "River," he said. "Yeah. When did you?" "The whole time," River said simply. "From the beginning, I draw what I'm paying attention to." He paused. "You've been what I was paying attention to." Eli looked at him for a long time. The fire in the wood stove was the only light. Outside, the November wind was doing its thing with the live oaks, and the horses were settled in the barn, and the 1,200 acres of the Callaway Ranch were doing what land does at night, being old and patient and utterly indifferent to the small human things happening inside the buildings on its surface. And yet somehow, always the context in which those things made sense. "Thank you," Eli said. His voice was rough and quiet. River looked at him with those amber eyes in the firelight, and what was in them was what had been building there for months, warm and specific and completely honest. Not a performance, not a careful approximation, the real thing. "You're welcome," River said. Epilogue: The Long View. There is a morning in December that I want to tell you about, because it is, in some ways, the truest image of how things are now. The light comes in through the east-facing bedroom window at about 7 in the morning and lands across the bed in the long diagonal bars that Eli has known all his life. The particular light of winter mornings on the Callaway Ranch, the light that he grew up watching and that he has never quite gotten over finding beautiful. It hits the wooden floor, the patchwork quilt, the old chest of drawers with the photograph of Marcus Sr. on it, and it hits River's face. River is still asleep. He is not a morning person, it turns out, except when some animal sound wakes him, and he is up and moving before Eli has registered the sound. But on ordinary mornings, on December mornings when the ranch is quiet and the horses are settled and there is no emergency anywhere, River sleeps with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a man who has, for the first time in a long time, found somewhere he is not waiting to leave. Eli sits on the edge of the bed and puts on his boots and watches the light on River's face for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough to feel the full weight of the particular thing. This is the particular gift of an ordinary morning. Then he gets up, he goes to the kitchen and makes coffee, the way he always has, in the kitchen that smells of cast iron and wood smoke, in the house that has been a Callaway house for 3 generations, in the life that is finally shaped like the life actually his. The coffee is ready, the boots are on. The horses are waiting and the land is waiting and the day has its requirements. He hears River's boots on the floor upstairs. He gets out 2 cups. The cottonwoods in the north section are bare now in December, their branches against the cold sky like the careful sketch of someone who loves the thing they are drawing. The creek is slower. The cattle are in the winter pastures. The gray gelding stands at the paddock fence and watches the morning arrive, and Juniper is at the barn door with her nose pressed against the wood in the way of a horse who has a person she is waiting for, and has learned to trust that the waiting will be worth it. Some things take a long time to arrive, the best things usually do. The ranch road is quiet this morning, no silver pickups, no new arrivals. The drifter has stopped drifting. The cowboy has stopped being afraid of himself. There is coffee in the kitchen, there are boots on the floor. There is a whole December of ordinary mornings ahead, and ordinary mornings, Eli Calloway has come to understand, are where your actual life lives. 1,200 acres of hill country, 2 chairs on the front porch. This is enough, this is in fact everything.
The end. And that is the story of how a mysterious drifter arrived at the Calloway Ranch on a June morning and changed everything. Quietly, slowly, the way the most real things always do. But here is what I didn't tell you. There was a letter and river canvas duffel bag, the one in the interior pocket. Behind the notebook, a letter has been carrying for over a year. A letter with a Colorado return address. A letter has never opened. If this story moved you, if Eli and River found their way into that part of your heart where slow burn romance live, please subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment below. Tell me your favorite moment from this story. What is the barn in the store? The cottonwood bend at sunset. The morning river showed Eli his drawings. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching and keep watching.